Mike, check 1 2. It's the Y2K collector, and the Switch is just one of those consoles that I had to really pause on collecting for because the Switch is somewhat of a black hole when it comes to the almost endless amount of games that you can collect on the Nintendo Switch. And it's not like one of those consoles where, in the past, when you looked at certain consoles, you knew certain consoles were good for certain genre of games, right? So like when you thought of the PlayStation 1, there are so many great RPGs on the PlayStation 1. When you thought of the Sega Saturn has some of the best arcade shoot 'em ups and arcade style action games ever. Same thing with the Sega Genesis. When you think about the PlayStation 2, even there's a ton of amazing RPGs on the PlayStation 2 as well. Certain consoles just do well with certain genres of games. It just seems like. And when it comes to the Switch, it just seems like no matter which genre you're a big fan of, if you're a fan of, shoot 'em ups, if you're a fan of RPGs, if you like strategy games, puzzle platformers, it almost doesn't matter what genre you like, you can easily find 300 games in any direction, right? Any any genre you like, you'll probably be able to easily collect 300 games of that style of game. Of course, there are exceptions, right? So, please, let's take everything with a grain of salt. I'm speaking in generalities, but for the most part, there's so many games on the console that you can find so many games and just collect for it. And for me, when I was collecting for the Switch heavily, there were a few genres that I was collecting for. Hack and slashers, like 3D hack and slashers, open world adventure games, 2D side scrollers, 2D hack and slashers, beat 'em ups, shoot 'em ups. Those were really like the types of games that really intrigued me the most. And that was what my Switch collection was mostly comprised of when it hit its peak of around 350 to 375 games. And then I just realized, I cannot collect all these games. I just I can't keep up. And not only because of the amount of general, AAA releases that were coming out for the Switch, but I was someone who followed all of the limited print companies like Limited Run and Super Rare and Strictly Limited and Nicalis and Merge and Pixel Heart Games and First Press Games and M2 and all the others, all the companies that are kind of like side quest companies that have these really amazing releases. Some of them release brand new games, some of them are re-releasing games that came out on older platforms. But when you factor in all of the brand new titles that were coming out for the Switch, along with all of the modern retro games or games that were being ported from other platforms, or even games that were only released in the arcade, never saw a US home console release, but somehow they wound up on the Switch. When you just considered all of those different types of games, it just really became one of these like black holes, in terms of consoles to collect for. And so I really had to just pause. I had to say, you know what, I can't do this anymore. It was just becoming too much, too much. It felt like too much. It really felt overwhelming, especially considering the fact that I didn't have all of the retro games that I wanted. And so because of that, I really slowed way down on my Switch collecting, like way down. I sold a lot of my Switch games, and I decided probably over a year ago now that I was really just going to focus on everything between Gen 3 and Gen 6. So, and primarily just looking at the Nintendo, the Super Nintendo, the Sega Genesis, the Neo Geo AES, the PlayStation 1, a little bit of N64, not too crazy with the N64, but N64 is a console that I'll collect for. The Dreamcast, of course, PlayStation 2, Xbox, and GameCube. And then when it comes to the handhelds, the Game Boy Advance, DS, 3DS, not so much. I was collecting for the 3DS, but the 3DS isn't as intriguing to me as it used to be. So, I've kind of slowed down, and I've definitely sold off a bunch of 3DS stuff. But in there also, I do have some 7th gen stuff. Although I don't collect really for the 7th gen at all, like I used to. I still do have like a small 360, PS3, and Wii collection. But those collections have really dwindled down. A lot of the games that I liked on the 360 were the same games that I liked on the PlayStation 3. And so I wound up actually getting rid of a lot of my 360 collection because I just had a lot of doubles. There's only a few like Xbox 360 exclusives that I wound up keeping when you consider games like Raiden 4 and Ultimate Alliance Gold Edition, Spider-Man Friend or Foe, Velvet Assassin, 99 Nights, the Part 1 and Part 2, Raiden Fighters, Fist of the North Star, Ken's Rage 2, Operation Darkness, just to name a few, right? Ninja Blade, some of those games weren't, they didn't have a PS3 counterpart. But outside of those like 360 exclusives, I kind of aimed a lot of my 7th gen collecting at the PlayStation 3. So that's where I have a lot of like, my Spider-Man games, my Saw games, my Transformers games, Splatterhouse, Blades of Time, games like that. So it's really allowed me, like concentrating on Gen 3 and Gen 6, it's really kind of given me a cutoff. Like I know there's a finite number of games between those generations that I actually want to collect and have in my collection. And so it made my curating process a lot easier, honestly. And it took a lot of pressure off, from feeling like I needed to keep up. Because after a while, even if you're just collecting limited run, they're dropping new stuff every month. After a while, you feel like you kind of need to keep up. And when you see a game that you really want, you almost want to go after it, And there have been so many games that have been released since I stopped collecting for the Switch like that, that I know if I was still collecting, I would have had to have gotten rather. When you consider games like the Rocket Knight collection, the Castlevania Dominus collection, even some recent releases like Eartheon, I still don't have the new Shinobi game. There's so many, and there's still some that are coming out that I really feel like I need to get. When you think about like Terminator 2D No Fate, I think that's gonna get a general release, so I don't need to worry about picking that up on like strictly limited or anything like that. But there's just a lot. There's a lot, and there are still some Switch games that, despite me wanting to get out of the console, that I felt like I'm glad I kept in my collection. And I still have a pretty solid collection of somewhere between 50 and like 75 games. And I was recently at a trade event where I had a big box of Switch games, and there are a few games that I'm glad that I didn't sell off. And these are a few of them. I'll just share a few of them with you here, of games that I almost sold, but I'm actually glad they're still in my collection. First is Metroid Dread. I'm glad that I did not sell Metroid Dread, primarily because I have not completed the game yet. I did get a good amount of the way through it. Started playing it when it first came out, was having a good time with it, but just kind of stopped, fell off, and started playing other games. And I'm glad I didn't get rid of this one, because this is one that I do want to keep in the collection. I know this is not one that's going to become scarce or anything like that. There are millions of copies of this game around, and I'm sure I'll be able to find it in a GameStop for years to come. But I'm glad that I don't have to do that. It's still in my collection, and this is one I'm glad I kept. Another one that I'm glad that I kept was Slave Zero X. It's a very interesting game, and it feeds really into the gameplay style that I'm a really big fan of. And that's that 2D side-scrolling, hack and slash style gameplay. And this game plays a lot like Strider 2 on the PlayStation 2. If you've ever played Strider 2, this game has almost like an identical art style. It almost has the same like gameplay feel almost. The only thing is that it is a little glitchy. I haven't played it in a while, so I don't know if there are updates that kind of remove some of the glitchiness with this game. But this is a really cool one, and I'm glad that, I didn't sell it, because this is one that I have a feeling will be harder to find. This is going to be one of those, because it is one of those more niche Switch games, and I feel like this one is going to be harder to find. So I'm glad that this one did not sell. Another one that I'm glad I still have is Bite the Bullet. If you're a fan of Metal Slug, you'll like this game. It's not as, it doesn't have the depth of a Metal Slug, but it's a really good attempt. And I don't remember if this got a general release, because this was a strictly limited release. And I think there were only a certain number of these made. Yeah, 2,300 copies. Now, I know we say that, I know there's a lot of Switch games that when they originally released, they had a limited number of copies, but I know there are companies that are reprinting these games, which thank God for them. Otherwise, some of these games would be astronomically high. But Bite the Bullet, I don't think is one of them. Even though this was a strictly limited release, this isn't an expensive game, really. This is kind of like this is maybe like a $40 or $50 game still. But I'm glad I didn't sell my copy, my original copy. I have copy number 33 out of 200, out of 2,300, right? Wait, no. What am I saying? My math is way off. Sorry, this is blurry. 748. This is their 33rd release. Sorry, but this is copy number 748 out of 2,300 games. So really cool to have that. Another one that I'm glad I didn't sell, Astral Chain. Astral Chain isn't super rare, and I think if you look hard enough, you can find this in most GameStops in the used section. You could probably order it offline. But Astral Chain is another one that I think is going to fall into not rare territory, but it's going to be one of those like games on the Switch that isn't like rare, but isn't as common as like a AAA Nintendo title. And it's going to be one that I think people wish they played looking back. Very cool story and very interesting gameplay. And I like this game. You know, I played this, I remember a few years back, I broke my foot and I was bedridden for a few weeks. And I remember I played this game like about halfway through, and it was a really good playthrough. Good story. I really liked it. But just one I got to pick back up again. So this is another one on the Switch that I really am looking forward to completing. So this is a good one. And then last but not least is probably one of the more recent pickups was the Marvel vs. Capcom Fighting Collection. The big motivation or a big part of the reason why I was even tempted to sell this game and not keep it on the Switch is because I have every one of these games individually on other platforms. Like I have the Punisher on the Sega Genesis. I have Marvel Superheroes on the Sega Saturn. Same goes for X-Men versus Street Fighter, Marvel Superheroes versus Street Fighter. Both of these I have on the Sega Saturn. Children of the Atom, I also have on the Sega Saturn as well. And then I have Marvel vs. Capcom and Marvel vs. Capcom 1, I only have on the Dreamcast. But Marvel vs. Capcom 2, I have on the Dreamcast, the PlayStation 2, and the original Xbox. So I didn't really need this, really. And I'll be honest with you, like the reason why I kept this one is purely convenience, right? I don't want to have to hook up those consoles, even though my Sega Saturn, my Dreamcast, and my Genesis are typically hooked up all the time. Just being able to have a one-stop shop for a lot of these fighters that are some of my favorite arcade fighters of all time is just super convenient. So that's a big part of the reason why I hung on to this one, and I'm glad I did. You know, same thing with the Capcom Fighting Collection Volume 2 with Rival Schools and Project Justice and those games. Even though I have those games individually on their original consoles, just having that ease of use is definitely, you know, cool to me. And so I'm glad I hung on to those. So, you know, I don't know where my journey with the Switch will go in the future. I'm still trying to make my way through all of the retro games that I want to add to my collection. And you know, the retro pickups have been solid. You know, they're harder to come by. Finding retro games that I really want are getting harder and harder to come by, because slowly but surely I'm checking off a lot of things off of my wish list. And there's really not a lot out there from a retro perspective that I really I want still, outside of just like my grails, the grail games that I really want to add to the collection. So once I probably do hit like all of my retro markers, eventually I probably will return to the Switch and pick that back up. And when I do, man, I'll be so excited because there's so much good stuff on the Switch that I really need to get my hands on. And hopefully by the time I make that transition back to the Switch, you know, prices aren't through the roof. So let me know what you guys think. Are you still collecting for the Switch? What are some of your favorite genres? What are you collecting? What are some games that you've picked up before they get crazy expensive? Let me know in the comments down below. I'll catch you in the next one. It's the Y2K Collector. Take it easy.